Well, hello, and thank you for listening to Happy Times and Places, a positively inclined Doctor Who episode commentary podcast in which I, Toby Haydock, have asked a friend to choose a Doctor Who story and secretly nominate their favourite things about it. I then watch the episodes, commentate along, and try to guess what those favourite things are.
Hello. I'm Richard James, actor, writer, podcast co-host of the Gerry Anderson podcast, and I have a story for Toby. I've chosen The Visitation from season 19, starring Peter Davison as the Doctor, my Doctor, as it happens. I remember watching this when it went out in 1980-something. It was the fourth story of Peter Davison's tenure, and by then, I think he was really hitting his stride. It's the most English of stories, really, for the most English of Doctors, which may or may not be a good thing, depending on what you like. But for me at the time, and since, it was a very good thing.
Well, hello everybody, welcome to Happy Times and Places, and it's an occasion to visit season 19, again, which I've been to quite a lot, but for various reasons I won't go into, apart from to say I've got people promising stuff from other seasons, but I don't think I've got anything recorded from season 20 apart from one, but that's from somebody who's already featured as a guest. I do have one from season 21 recorded. I've got a couple, one coming up and one that I'm waiting for because I'm trying not to have Daleks too close to each other, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so I seem a bit heavy with season 19 because I've just done Four to Doomsday, I've done Black Orchid, I've done Time Flight, but so Earthshock and Castrovalva will doubtless, done Kinder, Earthshock and Castrovalva will doubtless take a while, but Richard James, who I've never met, but I got in touch with because I loved his book on Space Precinct, which is not a series I knew brilliantly, but I'd been fascinated by it and really interested in its genesis. And I'd watched it at the time, and you could see certain things were going on, like certain actors were dubbed and certain actors dropped out, and I'd known an actor who'd worked on it who dropped out fairly quickly, a very good actor. So I knew there were sort of rumblings and things, and it had a difficulty. But I also knew that the people who'd worked on it, were very loyal to it and loved it. And Richard's book sort of is a very honest and interesting and insightful appraisal of the series that I sort of bought on a whim and devoured. And so then I reached out to him. I don't like that phrase. It sounds like a sort of business proposition. I sent him a message on social media, and he was lovely. And I think there's a couple of times Bernard is tipping the camera now. So what are you doing, Bernard? So Bernard has just tipped the camera over. It's facing the other way. Oh, Bernard, boo. But that's all right, I forgive him, because Bernard is a little bit... you're a bit angsty tonight, aren't you, Bernard? Because if you hear noises outside, it is not because this is a prologue where I send Bernard to investigate and he disappears, and then I have to prepare for battle, and you don't see me after the first 5 minutes. It's because it's actually the genuine November the 5th as I record this. So there is banging going on outside. No, I'm not living in France. No, there are fireworks going on outside. So you may hear the odd bang, and that might provoke the odd woof from Bernard. But I need to use all occasions that I can to record these podcasts. So Shirley Lee is out doing something. So she doesn't know I watch Doctor Who. She's never heard of Doctor Who. So I have to watch it when she's not here. So Richard, I've never actually met. We nearly met up a couple of times, and he was a very early. I have done his Gerry Anderson podcast, but he's a nice guy, very prolific, very skilled. And multi-talented, and one of us. But he's that great thing is he's sympathetic to sci-fi, even a fan and enjoyer of sci-fi, but has also been in it. So good for him. And I was thrilled when he said he'd do this. And like everybody who's done this early doors, he sent something very, very quickly, and it's probably languished on a hard drive now for a year or so. So I'm glad to have finally got to the Visitation, even if it's on a night where its opening moments are going to be replicated perhaps through the whole podcast. Depends how much I get done this evening. And Bernard's slightly discombobulated, so I might have to occasionally comfort him. But I think that's okay. I think this is, this isn't professionally recorded in a studio podcast. This is someone at home with their dog watching Doctor Who. I just happen to have got quite a nice microphone, so hopefully it sounds reasonable. But it will be warts and barks and bangs, if not the flashes and all. So we are going to kick off with episode 1 of The Visitation, a story that I very much enjoyed at the time in a season I felt was quite beige and sciencey. This, to me, felt a bit like, proper Doctor Who. But I was looking for faults when I was a kid. So, and I was not a great fan of the Davison Doctor when he arrived, unlike Richard, because Tom Baker was my Doctor, and there's nothing more a Doctor Who fan likes to do is celebrate the fact that it changes its format and then get really vexed when that format changes. However, now I love Davison. He's one of my favourite Doctors. But let us see what I make of episode 1 of, what would you say, a more traditional Doctor Who story, a pseudo-scientific, from the pen of one Eric Saywood. He'll be back later. And I'm going to press play in 3, 2, 1. Well, I'm not going to let you into too many behind-the-scenes secrets, but that was not the slickest to begin. I think because, this is set in the past and it's the future meets the past, modern technology is not all it's cracked up to be. So I started pressing play and it was too loud. So I thought, well, I don't want to keep telling the lady whose speaker name I can't say out loud or she'll interact with yours. So I thought, well, I'll start again. That's fine. It won't take more than a second because I said the lady's name and volume 3. And I thought, no, that because people have said when you do that, mine is affected. So then I started again. And in that process, the lady stopped working and it just connected to a tinny speaker above my head and sounded awful. So then I was like, okay, so then connected and then started, and BritBox started playing this at really slow speed. So I've had about 4 or 5 goes at starting this episode. So just to say, whilst we're looking at the past, modern technology is not all it's cracked up to be. There's a firework display on screen, a nice, simple... that's actually very nicely done, those lights in the sky. I love this prologue. So we have a sort of 5-minute bit, which, do you know what? Because I quite often missed the very beginning of Doctor Who, because either it clashed with something else or I was late back from school because I had to stay behind at school and could only come back when Mum picked me up. So I'm not sure I either saw, although I do remember, I think, seeing this bit in repeat because I remember Ralph getting killed. But anyway, I certainly missed a lot of beginnings. And this opening scene's brilliance only sort of showed itself to me when I started collecting videos much later. And it really is brilliant. There will have to be something else. It's a very nice shot. There will have to be something else that's really good to topple this prologue. In fact, these are the only, aside from Richard Mace, these are the only interesting characters that are human characters in the whole thing. We'll talk about Scythe Man later. And what a cast. Anthony Calf, who's recently returned to Doctor Who after I'd Who's rounded him. And he said he'd actually auditioned for Doctor Who a few times and not got it. He didn't feel particularly simpatico with Doctor Who, but he's had a fantastic career. And this, I think, is said as his first, or certainly an early telly. I knew him from Beau Geste, directed by Douglas Camfield when I was younger, but he's the senior officer in New Tricks. He's currently in SAS Rogue Heroes, which is airing as I watch this. I love that. I'll have my posset now. This is medicinal. I love all of that. There's, this is actually quite Saywoodian. They all sort of argue with each other and it's quite testy, but actually that here, because we don't know them very well, that is quite good shorthand for these people know each other. It's only when sort of people who live on spaceships who do it for the whole thing that you go, oh God, Eric Saywood, you do like sort of people not getting on very well. But at least Ralph and Anthony Carr are nice to each other. And Ralph is John Baker, who had been a Time Lord in the opening moments of Colony in Space. But he goes back to, he was going to be in the Quatermass Experiment. And then his part was turned into a non-speaking part. So he ended up not being in it. But he is one of the pub customers in Rudolph Cartier's 1984, a year later. A veteran actor who carried on acting until he died. Relatively recent. It's probably 20 years ago now, but he was still going. I love all of this because they've been sort of quite aggravated with each other, but now they're preparing to defend their house, and I love that. I love a laser gun and muskets in the same scene. I love that. And Savardant's brilliant. This is John Savardant, Fred Elliott as Squire John, and I worked with Savardant on Curry years and years ago, and he hated everybody. But because he was like, that's all we need, a vicar with a Tesco's bag, and I'd heard horror stories of him. He hates extras, and I think could be quite tricky. But I sort of went, oh, I was watching you in Yes Minister the other day, and I saw you in The Professionals there, and then sort of gave him a list of his credits. And so then we sat and talked for hours. He was like, a lot of actors don't know the old stuff, but you obviously know your stuff. And so I actually had a great time with him after, having to accept him being a bit sort of dismissive. But Anthony Carf actually said that, told me that Savardant was great with him. It was Anthony's first telly, and Savardant was very welcoming. So maybe he wasn't happy on Corrie or whatever. I remember he did say to me, they asked me to be this 20 years ago. I told them to off. And the inference being that then now when they asked him, he didn't have much choice, kind of thing. But he made a legend of Fred Elliott. He's a fantastic actor. But as I say, I have heard stories from people that worked with him back in the day. Nobody I know, but yeah, a few people who sort of passed through who said, well, he wasn't very nice. But as I say, I've heard from Anthony Carf the opposite. So we're all a mixed bag, aren't we? And as I say, I got a bit of both. He was a bit funny with me, and then I managed to charm him is the wrong word, but I threw his CV at him, and he was quite pleased about that we were talking about. So, and I talked about other actors that he'd worked with, and threw Kubrick into the mix and all of that. And he was, so he was great. So he was great with me, but I could tell it could have gone another way. But anyway, I'll have me posset now. He makes a great character there. I love the fact that John Savardant's been in Doctor Who because he's in Blake 7 twice. Isn't he? And two very different characters. He sort of, it charts the sort of course of Blake 7. He plays, he's the judge guy in Trial, isn't he? So it's quite a straight, sort of serious performance. And then he's in Orbit, which is where his performance resides. But he's great. He's great as Squire John. Valerie Pfeiffer, who's the female character in those scenes, is one of those who's sort of not done an awful lot else. So it's interesting, isn't it? You see her and you see Anthony Carf, and one goes on to have an absolutely blistering career, and one doesn't do much at all. That's the nature of the business. This is a nice shot of Nyssa in Tegan's mirror, and I actually quite like. And it's interesting because I will occasionally criticise the current or the more modern iteration of Doctor Who for being too tied to Earth. I think my ideal is that you're taken away from Earth and you can't just go keep visiting and sort of choose to stay with the TARDIS. You're taken away, and then you have to sort of wrench yourself away or carry on travelling. It's up to you, and there is, you have to accept that you have quite a horrifying life if you're travelling through time and space, seeing wonderful things. But the payoff is that if you escape from the horrors, you go back to, queues, traffic jams, bills, and all of that business. Bernard's gone a bit mad. He's drying himself on a chair and growling as he does it. But I actually quite like this in this time period because it makes it seem a bit more real that, Tegan's going to a job. And this, this is quite believable, especially in a series where people just sort of bugger off, that she's going, I'm preparing to leave and I'm going to say I miss you. Especially as actually we don't see it through. It turns out she's not going back to Heathrow, but they have that sort of goodbye, which suggests a real closeness between those two young women, which I like. I buy that. I think that's lovely. They've certainly let the grass grow since I was last there. I like very much. That's a nice line. And doesn't Tegan say the line, a broken clock tells the right time twice a day, which is on the picture of Peter Davison, the colour picture in the middle of Doctor Who: A Celebration. And so I was surprised to find it was a quote not from him but from her. And I have used it once. In fact, that a broken clock keeps better time than you. At least it's accurate twice a day. Yeah, which is a lovely line. And I was, for many, many years, I was the warm-up man for University Challenge, and always had a nice chat with Jeremy Paxman, who's a nice man, and I think I'd lost a bit of weight, and he hadn't seen me since the previous block, and I was wearing a suit, and he said, "Oh, Toby, you're looking good," or whatever, and I said, "Well, even a broken clock tells the right time twice a day," and it made him laugh. I thought I just got a laugh from Paxman from a line from Doctor Who. This remastering of these film sequences is absolutely glorious, and there is something nice about seeing the TARDIS in the English countryside. I rather like that. I think it's a sight I would rather take for granted at the time, because, it's not long since Castrovalva, is it? There's a nice picture in the Doctor Who 20th anniversary special of these four in these outfits. So I'm quite nostalgic about them, although I do think they do look a bit of an odd bunch, and I don't mean odd as in winningly incongruous, like perhaps Tom Baker in his scarf. But that smoke going. I do love Nissa's costume, though. I love Nissa's costume. I love that crushed red, that burgundy velvet. It's beautiful. Yeah. Well, I've talked before about the let's give everyone a costume policy, which I don't think helps Doctor Who. But all this stuff is lovely. The guys with the face coverings. I mean, talking post-COVID and people wearing masks and covering up from plague. That's resonant of recent years. But actually, these sort of simple villager costumes, but just the simple act of having their faces covered, that suggests plague, that suggests uncleanliness, that suggests very basic protection from something that, as we know, is rampant and terrible. And I like the way that the Fifth Doctor talks about potassium nitrate and sulfur, primidogama. The way that he sort of explains the science, it trips off him quite nicely. And here we have, gosh, he's so young looking, isn't he? And we have a fight, and he's not bad. He's quite a handy fighter too. Whereas Adric is that bit where Adric's that they're supposed to push the guy over Adric. I'm afraid the three of them make a complete foul up of. Now the villager is not great. I wish they'd given him a name, because the villager is played by Richard Hampton, who's an excellent actor. He was one of the first people at the National Youth Theatre, so he's a contemporary of David Weston and Julian Glover and people like that. I think he went to Allen's School even, but he's been an actor for a long time and has done loads and loads and loads. And in fact, I mentioned to David Weston, and David said, I'll give you his phone number now. And I was like, oh no, I won't take it now. I'll call you. And then, of course, I chickened out and shouldn't have done. And so anyway, I should really try to get an interview with Richard Hampton, because he's a really good actor who's done loads, and could probably trip over more convincingly than Matthew Waterhouse, who gives Susan's trip in The Five Doctors a run for its money for worst trip in Doctor Who. And here we have the marvellous Richard Mace, played by Michael Robbins, who, because I think Richard Hampton is very good as a villager, but he's hardly a character. Now that Squire John and his family are toast, the wonderfully costumed Richard Mace, played by Michael Robbins, whose performance seems to divide people. I think he's fabulous, and I think maybe because I've listened to the commentary for this, and Matthew Waterhouse mentions that Robbins thought this was terrible, and I think Matthew's actually very funny when he says, "Fortune has made me itinerant," is a great line, and Saywood clearly has great fun writing this character. It's odd that he can write very, very rich characters, but everybody else, apart from the pteroleptal leader now in this, is very, very bland. But Michael Robbins, didn't enjoy being it or thought this was terrible. And Matthew's very funny on the commentary when he says, when Michael Robbins says, "This is the worst thing I've ever been in," and Matthew's like, "But you were in On the Buses," which I think is it's a pretty good riposte. Davison's great at all of that, getting the pistol out and using it properly, just putting it on his arm so he looks like he knows what he's doing with an antique gun. He's such an actor of such great sort of observation, and he fills the spaces. Richard May's such a service, and I like this idea of I'm drawn to characters who are. He is, isn't he? I was once a noted thespian. He's an ex-actor, so of course I love all of that's right up my street. And he's great. But I do quite like this, doesn't he? He says, "Oh, I've been aching for some company," and they sit down to have a chat, and nobody says anything. I think that's quite witty, and he's good at being funny, but also judging the seriousness of the situation. And I think setting a Doctor Who story in the time of plague, which is one of the earliest things that you studied at school. I mean, I remember doing the Roses of Eyam and yes, the Black Death and the Pudding Lane, and all of that was very much seeped into what we were taught as kids. So I think as a setting for a Doctor Who story, it's a fabulous idea. And I always love it when Doctor Who juxtaposes the futuristic with the historical. It allows for those great, the visual dissonance, of androids versus muskets, but also the clash of expectation of time, because to the people here, something alien in this time would give rise to superstition, and it would seem magic. What seems scientific to us seems magical to them. That's a great, that's a great leveler as well. That that anything that stuff that we know is technology, they think is magic, and that helps. That could be quite witty and interesting about things that are unexplained, just depend on, where you are at. And I think all of that stuff is deployed very, very nicely. Peter Moffat gets a lot of stick as a director, but he's very efficient. I think this is perfectly well shot, and there's some nice shadowy work going on here in the barn. And I remember, as a kid, you see, we'd had Castrovalva, which had two sort of establishing episodes that were set in the TARDIS, and then it was more what I called Bidmead's Doctor Who and the Maths, which I have to say was not a great draw for me as a kid. I love that stuff now, particularly some of the poetic dialogue in Castrovalva, I think is lovely. But at the time, I was aching for a monster. And then Fort Doomsday comes along, and it's got a monster, but he sort of sits there yelling at people, and that was Doctor Who and the dance demonstrations for Doomsday. Even that had a really exciting title. And then Kinder was sort of Doctor Who and the sort of philosophical. I didn't really get Kinder as a kid either. I have to be honest. I love Kinder now. Go back and listen to my Happy Times and Places on it. It's and James Charlton, who is credited in this, is the guy in City of Death, not credited, who draws Romana's face as a clock. That's where you might have seen him before in a Doctor Who, but not read his name on the credits. Bernard, shh. So he's not he's not credited on his other Doctor Who's, but he gets credit here because he occasionally gets to walk on and all of that. A friend of mine, Ben Jolly, who's very good at finding actors, found James Charlton, and I think got him to sign something and had a chat, but. Didn't say he told him any amazing stories, but I admire Ben's very good at doorstepping people. Was it at a bridge club or something? It was anyway. He tracked him down to somewhere. People must be terribly surprised. Hello, you're the guy from Doctor Who. How on earth do you know this? A man of a very sour disposition. That's all really nice. Bernard, you're of quite a sour disposition tonight, aren't you? Because of the It's all right, Bernard. It's just the fireworks, and it's not pterodactyls, who aren't in this episode, are they? No. Or do they get a bit of hand action? No, I don't think they do, because it's that weird cliffhanger this week, isn't it? Well, not this week, because it's 2 episodes a week. So anyway, yes, when we got to the Visitation, it seemed to me, I remember at the time, to be a slightly more sort of what I expected from Doctor Who. You know, it's a bit like the Time Warrior, isn't it? A sort of lone alien in a historical setting. So it felt quite sort of comfortably Doctor Who-y to me, even though, of course, I then gave it minus points for the destruction of the sonic screwdriver, which was enough to make me feel very badly disposed to a story, because anything from the past of Doctor Who was good. Anything that seemed to denigrate or desecrate the past by this presumptuous new regime, because I love Doctor Who, but I know it's not as good as it used to be, to steal a phrase. I was very much that kind of fan, which, I mean, just amuses me now, because there are no eras I particularly like more or less than others, really, and I certainly don't dislike the Davison era like I sort of resisted it at the time. But I think I've talked about that before, so I don't want to repeat myself. But I only say it for full disclosure. But I also then need to say that since then I've grown up, and I love all of that. I mean, it's actually interesting how sort of pedestrian some of this is, and the pacing of this is sort of quite heartily. And I remember being quite surprised, because the story doesn't really get going in this episode. But when I revisited it, the sort of shutting of the windows and the little clues scattered about, I think, are rather nicely done. There's a sort of sense of creeping mystery that it is a sign that there's perhaps not enough story for the whole 4 episodes, but I don't really mind that. We've had plenty of establishing episodes, Ark in Space 1, and Web Planet 1, where they're sort of mood pieces to sort of immerse you in the world, and just those, we've got power packs. I mean, it's almost a shame, I think, maybe that we saw the android, although the android is very beautiful, in that opening scene, because well, I suppose we do see the laser beam as well, but I'm not sure we should have seen the android as early on, but I suppose we need something that's good, that's going to keep us watching, and for all this historical bit to say no, there are scary aliens in this, but I do actually quite like the slow build up, and I think the setting in the plague is very evocative and very interesting, and it means there's a threat there already before we know of the alien threat. The very environment is hostile, so it is quite heartily, actually, this slow build up, these scattered mysteries, and the land in which we are in, a land of fear indeed, being one that is quite hostile, and then we have this really weird cliffhanger. And I remember my friend saying something about so maybe had I... No, I'm sure I remember my friend saying, there's this mysterious wall. So did I not see this first time round? No, I must have done. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You can't tell me, and I'm too... But I remember my friend... But maybe I missed the first episode. But I normally remember the episodes I missed. Carnival of Monsters 4 and 5 Faces of Doctor Who, Full Circle 2. But this is a really curious cliffhanger. But actually, on paper and in memory, you sort of go, it's actually not that interesting. They just can't find the Doctor. But I think the music builds it up nicely. The fact that we've seen the window closed, the fact that we've got that what we know is the android's gloved hand locking them in, I think it sort of piles on the tension. I actually quite like the pacing of that and the atmospherics of that, very much. And it looks gorgeous. All that film work looks gorgeous. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. I thought that was terrific. I'd have hoped maybe John Savdent got slightly better billing than that, but there we go. Maybe a single caption for his one episode. But Anthony Calf, lovely, lovely man. I wrote to him because he was in a play at the West End, but I didn't think he'd say yes because it's Anthony Calf. He's done loads, and he rang me up and said, yeah, come along. And then as I was on the way to the theatre, I saw Struan Roger, who's the voice of the face of Beau, and I remember tweeting, I'm on my way to interview Charles from The Visitation. I've just seen the face of Beau. Odile Dixmirio, I think is a great name. Ken Starkey, I don't know if has anyone interviewed Ken Starkey? Phil Newman will have done if anybody has. So there we go. That is episode 1 of The Visitation. And so I have to choose. Well, I mean, my favourite thing from episode 1 of The Visitation is without... I mean, look, I love Richard Mace, so he's going to have to get mentioned somewhere, I'm guessing. I think the setting is a really good idea to go, how can we tell a really interesting Doctor Who story? What's a period of history that would lend itself to the Doctor Who treatment? And as we will discover, I think it infuses itself into the story throughout very, very well indeed. Is the setting of the plague, very nice, and it brings rats with it. Well, we'll get to them, I'm sure. That's very efficiently done as well. I like the sort of Hartnell-esque that it's an exercise in mood and build-up and scattering little clues, and the environment itself being part of the threat. But for me, and I love the design of the android. I think the android looks great. I like that idea of going, well, just because it's a deadly killer android doesn't mean it can't be sexy, jeweled, nice to look at. There's some thoughtfulness gone into that to allow us to get a striking visual, but to make some sort of sense of why it is like that, rather than everyone in space has funky shiny things. No, but it has to be. It's an unusual thing, and when Doctor Who does it well, it does it very, very well. It's where you're introduced to a small number of characters. They're all pretty well drawn. They're all very nicely acted. I think particularly Anthony Calf does a good job, but Savdent, shows why it's quite good to upcast where you can. So you've got a young actor who's going on to great things, who's good, and then you've got a noted and recognisable character actor who looks like he might end up being the person that meets the Doctor. Maybe they've escaped the house, meets the Doctor, and then would just go, Doctor, sir, I will reward you handsomely. My house has been invaded by mechanical men, or whatever. But we actually never see them again. But all of that stuff, I'll have me posset now. This is medicinal. I know this causes us problems later, that Eric Saywood likes everybody he writes to argue with each other, but actually it works very nicely in that little time capsule that serves the story not at all, except to say there's something deadly and alien in the house, and why the house is abandoned. But it gives us an emotional pull to that because, well, it's not just that it's empty; it's that it's empty of the people that used to live in it, and we've met them, and we got to know them in a brief amount of time. And it also gave us, I love a Doctor Who laser beam. I love late 70s, early 80s Doctor Who laser beam. And these are laser beams in an old country house, laser beams versus muskets. And I like the fact that they blow holes in the walls and all that. But seeing a zap from a laser beam, yes, please. And there'll be a few more of those too. So for all of those reasons, the acting, the writing, the characters, and just its very existence and what it is there for in the story, it has to be. And I will surely go off Richard James, who I've never met, but I've always enjoyed chatting to online. And we have spoken in person, but again, through the medium of Zoom. And he's written a marvellous book, and he's a great podcaster. But you can go off a man, and might very well, if he doesn't choose the thing that surely everyone would choose from part 1 of The Visitation, which is the prologue. I was going to say the epilogue then, but it's not the epilogue. So I will see what Richard says is his favourite thing from episode. I've paused it somewhere. Where the heck is it? Here it is. Richard James. For those who are listening to the podcast, which will come out years before the video, Richard has Peter Davison's hat hanging on his door and a cardboard cutout of Captain Scarlet flanking him over the shoulder. But they are not choosing their favourite. Peter Davison's hat and Captain Scarlet are not choosing their favourite thing. From episode 1, part 1 of the Visitation, Richard James is. What's he going to choose? Is it the prologue?
My little thing from the first episode is I love the fact that the Doctor arrives at Heathrow Airport, but 300 years too early. I like it because here we have a more fallible Doctor than we're used to seeing, especially after Tom Baker's sort of bombastic portrayal of the part, with this sort of Hyperion detachment, I think was the phrase that was coined. But here we have a more human Doctor, shall we say, who got things wrong and made mistakes. And I rather liked that.
Interesting. He didn't choose the prologue, but I haven't gone off him, because actually, this is why one gets different people's perspectives. I had enjoyed the fact that and the joke, the grass is a lot greener, blah de blah, and the fact that we'd had the false goodbye from Tegan, which seemed so real. She's actually saying goodbye and I'll miss you to Nissa, and that's lovely. Oh, it's not going to actually happen. It was just a nice moment between the two women. And so I'd enjoyed that moment, but I hadn't thought of it as, oh yes, the Doctor is a bit vulnerable. I love the fact that the TARDIS never gets you where it means to, unless of course you really need it to. But I love the fact that TARDIS doesn't work properly, because I always identify with that more than I do with, the best goddamn crew who have the best goddamn ship in the fleet. Well, that's no good to me. I could never be part of that. I'm not the best at anything. But to be in something that doesn't work properly, and yet by hook or by crook we still manage to do our best, and you can still save the day, even if the thing you're in doesn't work and you don't know how to work it. If you approach life with a bit of, if you try and be intelligent, if you try and grasp with life's absurdities and retain your sense of humour and your sense of justice, even if all the tools at your disposal are a bit knackered and you're a bit wayward yourself, you can still do it. So I love that fallibility that Richard talks about, but I've never really thought of Davison particularly in that way, as opposed to as a contrast to Baker. But now that Richard's put like that I do, especially, yes, that detachment, that loftiness, that sort of venerable aspect that Tom Baker has, and especially when it's got the sort of mournful countenance that he sports in season 18, to have this sort of fresh-faced younger Doctor who, makes mistakes, and definitely is, yes, he is vulnerable, and can look wounded, can't he? That is a good observation, and I think that's a good thing to choose. But it's not what I chose. I chose what I thought was the obvious thing to choose. But it's, of course, nothing's obvious until you see it. Because now that Richard's chosen that seems a very obvious observation that I didn't make throughout the whole thing. So I'm very happy about that, because it proves that two heads are better than one. So I think I came up with something interesting, and so did Richard. So a plague on neither of our houses. Until next time, thanks for listening / watching. Well, thanks very much for listening to Happy Times and Places, which is presented by me, Toby Haydock. My special guest for this edition is Richard James, who can be found on Twitter at Richard N. James, and do buy his Space Precinct book. It's fabulous. I'm grateful to Richard and to the patrons who make these podcasts possible, and they include Mark Trevor Owen, Russell Parker, John Rumfitt, Gavin Rymil, Tom Selinsky, Matt Sawyer, Samuel, no surname for Samuel, Edward Salt, Keith Say, Frank Shales, Christopher Sharp, John Sheehan, Paul Shields, Brian Sinclair, Trevor Smith, Richard Smith, Andrew Snedden, David Spencer, David Spofford, Chris Stokes, Adam Stone, Mark Swan, Paul Taylor-Greaves, Dr. Gary Thomas, Jason Thompson, Sidney Truitt, Fan Man Sang, John Turner, Lee Wakerley, and Gary Wales. The music is by Dave Gates and the artwork by Dylan Patterson. So yes, sorry if you can hear, I don't think you heard many fireworks out there during the commentary, but they're banging away now. So patrons will be hearing this the week after. So I'm almost live for patrons, which when you're listening to this in the real world, you'll realise, hang on, it's nowhere near November the 5th. It's about 6 months later. That's because if you are a patron, not only do you get your name mentioned, like what you heard on the credits, you are also this far ahead, as November the 5th ahead from where you are now listening if you're not a patron. And patrons can sign up if you want to be one at patreon.com/Toby Haydock. You get advance releases, hot off the press, you get bonus material, and you get your very own podcast called Far Too Much Information. Now look, not everyone can afford the Patreon model, which starts from as little as £3 a month. And you can get a 10% discount on even that, and indeed any tier, if you sign up for a year in advance. But look, bills are going sky high, the trains don't work, things are on strike, there's even excrement being flushed into the sea. The world's going to hell in a handcart. So, not paying for a podcast is probably scant recompense and probably quite deserved, deserved loosening of the financial constraints. However, if for some reason you have a good month or you particularly like an edition or it's just how you prefer to do it, you can do what's called buying me a coffee at Ko-fi, which is Ko-fi, kofi.com/Toby Haydock. There are no exclusives, there are no advanced releases or anything like that, but it is a way of funding a creative, which is what I purport to be, and it also justifies my decision to keep these ad-free. I think it's the way that we consume entertainment is ever changing, but I think this thing whereby we put the stuff out there on trust, and it takes work and it takes equipment and it takes time, and try and make these as close to broadcast possible as is possible, broadcast quality as is possible. Now you see, if that had been broadcast, we'd have cut that in post. Well, I say we, the producer would have, but there's no producer, there's just me, so that's what you get. And this is the post credits bit, doesn't count. But look, yeah, the way that we do things now is we chuck things out there, and we have to be a little bit cap in hand, which is why I have the Patreon, which is why I have the Ko-fi, and it's a way of funding creatives. And if you like what they do, you can contribute and justify their industry, if you like, or industriousness. Not their the industry will. The industry will prosper with or without me in it, but my industriousness does need sponsorship, I guess. And justifies keeping these things ad-free. So that's Patreon and Ko-fi. But what costs you nothing, if you just want to be supportive by spreading the word, please tell cyberspace, tell Facebook, tell Twitter, and most importantly, tell iTunes, Spotify, and all the places, all the repositories of podcasts, by giving these a 5-star rating and lots of lovely lines of review. That really, really does help. Oh dear, poor old Bernard's getting the collywobbles because it's the pteroleptil spaceship is landing outside. So I will keep this brief. I don't like to date these really because it's not a current affairs podcast. There's a lot of excellent Doctor Who podcasts which like, what's the episode that's just been on and what's in the Doctor Who news at the moment. I like to think that you can sort of dip into these wherever. They have a timeless quality. If you want to fancy listening to somebody banging on about the Visitation, doesn't matter if I recorded this on November the 5th or January the 59th. But there we go. It always reminds me of the 5th of November. Remember the actor Ron Pember, who was still very much alive the last 5th of November, but has since passed away. But I did manage to get him an obit in The Guardian, even though his death was announced a little bit late. And he'd never done a Doctor Who. Well, he did slip back, Ron Pember, but he never did a TV Doctor Who. But he never actually starred in anything really, apart from He was a sort of semi-regular in Secret Army, but he got his name front of credits, and I was able to persuade the Guardian to feature Ron Pember, because he was a recognisable character actor who wasn't in the Visitation. So why I'm talking about him because it's the 5th of November, or as it's known in theatrical Twitter circles, not theatrical, just silly people who like character actors Twitter circles. Remember the actor Ron Pember. So yes, even though he wasn't in the Visitation, he did have to wrangle Eric Saywood dialogue in Slipback, where he played Seedle, one of the two Seedle and Snatch. Sonic Saywood in the two of the coppers, weren't they? In Slipback, the then very rare slice of Doctor Who audio drama. There've been a few additions to the audio/Doctor Who interface since. Anyway, there we go. The fireworks. I can see fireworks through the trees. Beautiful sight. Horrible sounds that scare the dog, and that probably, let's face it, being let off by miscreants, because I don't think there's an organised bonfire down here in South Manchester. I used to stand on the roof when I lived in Crouch End. We used to stand on the roof and watch the firework display at Alexandra Palace, and it used to light up the sky. And of course also Alexandra Palace, home of Quatermass and early BBC TV, but they stopped doing that after a while because they couldn't afford to do it anymore. It's a shame, because we got a really good view from our roof. But now that I don't live there anymore, I suppose it's one less thing I'm missing out on because it's not actually happening. Anyway, I hope there are fireworks in your life, but of the, nice, as in pops and jolliness and light, rather than noise, frightened pets, and a secret desire to kill all young people. So yeah, I hope they're metaphorical fireworks in your life, giving it a bit of snap, crackle and pop.